Okay, so what we're going to be doing now is we're going to be building up our Init Dot Php file, our core and our chat classes. Now we're just going to be defining what we're going to be doing here and making a connection to our database. So we're not going to be fully completing these, but we're going to get an overall idea of what we need to do, and then we can just sort of fill in the gaps to retrieve the information. And that will be extremely easy once we've sort of defined the skeleton of our classes, if you like. So the first thing really to look at is the init.php file and what this will involve. Now this will be included on any page that needs to access the database, the chat class, and start sessions, so we can sort of retrieve session data. And in here we're also going to temporarily define a constant called logged in, and we're going to set this value to true. Now this isn't anything complicated, it just is allowing me to define that the user is signed in, so we can do the relevant security checks when we're posting data, things like that. So let's go ahead and start a PHP tag in init.php, and let's go ahead and start our session. So for every Ajax call, this session start here is going to be executed or run, and we're going to start a session. Then we're going to be able to post these messages as the user. Now otherwise you can also see I've started this session here. It's slightly confusing, but the nature of how I'm doing this means I have to start the session here to originally take this session value, and then in init.php, which as I said is executed for every refresh of our application to pull in data, we also need to start a session as well. So we're also going to define a constant, so we're going to define a value and set this to true, and that value is going to be logged in, and that's just going to be, you know, some various checks. We're also going to require in two files, and these are going to be in our classes folder. Remember, we have chat.php and we have core.php. So the first one we're going to include is core.php and then chat.php. Now chat is going to be the class that we're going to pull data in and push data to the database, and that's going to extend from core, which is going to house our database functionality. So if you don't need to know how to create your database functionality, then you probably should go ahead, skip the video, and just start to look at what we're going to be doing fully in chat.php, although we are defining the the methods that we're using in this, so it may be a good idea to watch anyway. So in core.php, what are we going to do? Well, obviously start a PHP tag, and we're going to create a class called core. Now inside of here we're going to create some properties, which are just variables in PHP, and we're also going to create some methods, which are essentially functions. So this isn't anything complicated, it's just a very, very light touching on OOP just to make everything a bit better. So we're going to have some protected properties, which is going to be DB and result. Now DB is going to be the link to the database connection, and result is basically going to be just when we query, we're going to set the result of the query to this variable here. They're protected, so they can be accessed by classes that are inherit this core class, but we can't access it directly if we instantiate the class. We're also going to have a private rows, which is just what we're doing within our rows method, which will just be adding rows to this to then return to the user. So we'll see this a bit later on. So we're going to create a constructor, or the construct method, the magic construct method, which will instantiate, it will instantiate a MySQLi object, which is going to connect to our database. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this DB is equal to new MySQLi, and then I'm going to define the host, username, password, and database. So localhost, root, no password, and site. So these will obviously differ from user to user. So basically what we're doing here is we're creating a new connection to the database, and we're storing it inside of this DB here. And that's because later on we're going to be using this to query the database, so we need something to be able to reference it. It just beats putting it as some kind of global variable. Okay, so we're also going to have a method called query, and this is going to take an SQL string, which is then going to be executed as a query and then stored in the result up here. So we're also going to have a function called rows, which is going to loop through the rows that are returned from the query, and then they're going to return that as an array. So this is our rows array up here. So we could even say equals new array, but we don't need to do that. Okay, so let's go ahead and create our query method. So I'm basically going to say, well, what I'd do is I'd say this db query, and then I'd pass in the SQL that's been passed. Now I need to store this query somewhere, and I'm going to store it in result. So I'm just going to say this result is equal to or equals this value here. So this is now our result object that's been returned, and we can start to do stuff like fetch an associative array of the results and bits and bobs like that. So in rows, we're going to have a loop that's going to loop through this data and then output it. So we'll see all this in action later on. So if you don't quite understand how this is working, then you will get the hang of it. So let's go ahead and create a for loop. Now what we're going to do is we're going to set the initial variable to 1, and we're going to say while x is less than or equal to, now this is slightly trickier, but we're going to say this db, so we're referencing our original database connection, and we're going to say affected rows. So these are rows that have been affected by our last query, which will be here, and then we're going to say x++. So this is going to loop for however many results that are returned from the query we pass here. We're then going to say this rows, and we're going to append to the array. So this is appending to this variable here, and this will automatically create an array for us, so we don't need to explicitly define it up here as I mentioned earlier. Now what we're going to do is we're going to say this result fetch assoc. So we're fetching an associative array from the result here, which we've stored as our query. Remember, it returns the result object. This then becomes the result object, and we return the associative array of the results. We then put it into rows, so we append to the elements in the array, and then we return this rows. Now, that's all we need to do for our core class. So this may or may have not made sense, but either way, it's nothing different to what you'd do if you were just doing this procedurally. So it's exactly the same thing. Just think of these as functions and these as just variables, which is what they are. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the chat.php file. Now, we're not going to entirely do this. We're going to just look at, the outline of it and what methods that we're actually going to use. And as I said, we're extending from core so we can use the query method that we've just created. So I'm going to say here class chat extends core, and in here I'm going to define the methods that I'm using. No properties in this one, or variables. We just need two methods, one to fetch messages and one to throw messages. So, or throw a message, so it will throw a message into the database, and the other will fetch messages. So public function fetch messages, and this will query db and return rows. That's all we're doing in that one. The second is throw message. And you'll see why I couldn't use fetch and throw on their own, because throw is a reserved word, because when we throw exceptions, things like that in object-oriented programming, even if we were doing this procedurally, we couldn't use the reserved word throw. So I've had to say fetch messages, throw messages, long way around. So in here, what we're doing is we need to take a user ID and a message. So this will take the user ID that we're sending it as and the message, and then insert this into the database. So insert into DB. That's all we're doing. So this is the overall outline of our class, our chat class. And in chat.php, which is the file that we're going to constantly hit when we Ajax to it, is going to instantiate this class, and then it's going to basically either throw messages into the database if a user's hit return and they've typed a message, or it's going to pull data from it every X seconds, so every 5 seconds or every 10 seconds it's going to just refresh. So that's basically chat.php and core.php. We then have included these in here. I'll just go ahead over to my browser and refresh, make sure that nothing's broken. Well, it wouldn't be at the moment, because what we would need to do is go ahead and include this. So a sensible idea would just be to go up here and require core init.php. This is going to include all of our files together, and it will tell us if we've got any messages. The only error that we've got is a session has already been started, ignoring, which is absolutely fine because we know that we've started a session here, and we also start a session in init.php. This line was just for testing. So we've created our chat.php, core.php, and our init.php, and we can proceed here to actually start to pull results from the database.